Thank you for joining us today. We will be live soon. Thank you all for joining us. Please enjoy the event.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I am Bob Shireman, Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation. Welcome to today's discussion about student debt cancellation. The Century Foundation, or TCF, conducts research, develops solutions, and drives policy change to make people's lives better. The Student Borrower Protection Center, co-sponsor of today's event, engages in policy advocacy to protect borrowers' rights and advance economic opportunity. Facilitating today's discussion is Tiara Moultrie, a fellow on TCF's higher education team. Tiara, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Bob. As mentioned, my name is Tiara Moultrie, and I will be facilitating today's event. Just 2 months ago, the Biden-Harris administration unveiled its plan for wide-scale student debt relief. Student loan debt, both federal and private, affects millions of American families. We've entered a new landscape of financialization in which debt doesn't simply mean you owe money. Your debt can block you from other aspects of the financial world, making access to the middle class all the more difficult. You don't just owe money, your debt can block you from lots of things. Borrowers face considerable challenges in repayment, whether through the general inability to make payments or the interest accrual and capitalization that cause debt balances to skyrocket even as borrowers make monthly payments. It's important to remember there is no standard borrower. Student loans affect those who are young and old, poor, working, and middle class, and even those who didn't attend college themselves. There are non-completers who don't reap the economic benefits of their post-secondary pursuits. and graduates who face uphill battles in repayment because their institutions offered little in the way of return on investment. There are institutions that prey on vulnerable and unsuspecting students, and victims of predatory institutions are often left with debts they cannot pay off. If they default on their loans, it hurts their credit, and they can face years of garnished wages, seized tax refunds, not to mention difficulty borrowing to pay for a house or a car or to return to school. Their credit is ruined, and that can also make it harder for them to get certain jobs. But bolstered by the recent debt relief announcement, in addition to the limited public service loan forgiveness waiver, now is the time to call for action on college accountability and affordability. During today's event, we'll discuss things like debt-free college, the need for investments in institutions that best serve students of color, and accountability measures to protect students from predatory institutions, predatory student financing products, and loan servicers who harm borrowers through mismanagement of debt forgiveness programs and harassment. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions through the registration period. We will do our best to address these and any questions added to the Q&A feature during the event. Throughout the panel, we'll include links to resources and other relevant information. Please note this event is being recorded and live streamed. Again, if you'd like to submit a question for our panelists, please do so using the chat feature. Now let's get started. I'm happy to introduce our panelists who will discuss how we can build on this moment to promote broader higher education system change. Peter Granville is a senior policy associate at the Century Foundation, studying federal and state policy efforts to improve college access and affordability. His research promotes equity in the design and operations of financial aid programs, as well as financial security for student loan borrowers. His work has also shaped state policy to increase low-income students' take-up of federal benefits through the FAFSA and SNAP. Prior to joining TCF, Peter published research on state higher education finance at the Institute for Research on Higher Education at the University of Pennsylvania. And he mentored students as an academic coach at Haverford College. He holds a BA in mathematics and English from Kenyon College and an MS in education and higher ed from the University of Pennsylvania. Carolina Rodriguez works at the Community Service Society of New York. She is the director of the Education Department Consumer Assistance Program, a program that helps New Yorkers manage and, when possible, eliminate their student loan debt. Prior to this position, Carolina was an associate supervising attorney of the Health Initiatives Department at CSS, where she oversaw a statewide network of community-based organizations and small business counseling consumers on health insurance and healthcare access issues. She also managed the largest health insurance enrollment network in New York State. Carolina has a master's in social work from Columbia University and a JD from the University of California at Berkeley. Ben Kaufman is the Director of Research and Investigations at the Student Borrower Protection Center, our co-host for today. At SBPC, he previously worked as Head of Investigations and Senior Policy Advisor, and as Policy and Research Associate. Before joining SBPC, Ben worked as a Director's Financial Analyst at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and in investment banking at JP Morgan. Ben earned his BA and MA in public policy at Stanford, writing undergraduate and graduate theses on issues in consumer finance. And last but certainly not least, Jared Bass is the Senior Director for Higher Education at the Center for American Progress. Prior to this role, Bass was a professional staff member on the House Appropriations Committee, where he helped shape COVID-19 relief legislation, including the CARES Act, Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, and the American Rescue Plan. He also served as Senior Counselor for Education and Strategy in the Education Policy Program at New America, the Federal Director at the Post-Secondary National Policy Institute, a Senior Policy Advisor within the Office of Planning, Evaluation and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education, and the lead higher education staffer on the House Committee on Education and the Workforce Democratic Staff. A very powerful panel indeed. To begin, I'm going to start with Ben Kaufman. Ben, the federal government plays a key role in the way that student loan debt is administered. That's why consumer protection advocates, legislators, and activists have spent years demanding the government intervene on behalf of the millions of borrowers locked in a never-ending cycle of debt repayment. What do you think made this moment prime for action on the federal level? And even after this moment, how do we ensure information about other protections, things like income-driven repayment and default resolution, reach the vulnerable communities who need access?
Well, thank you so much for the question, Tiara, and thank you to everyone who's here. It's so great to be on this panel with such great advocates and researchers. Please also tell me if I'm talking too fast for our interpreters. I tend to talk kind of quickly. Such an important question, and in fact, today there was even more news on the front of student debt cancellation and relief. It makes sense to be on a panel when we think about how a lot of the progress that we've seen under the Biden administration has really taken a village. Going back decades of folks advocating for and shedding light on the ways that the student loan system has been broken generally and with regard to specific protections and programs that have not lived up to their promises and have not been delivered to borrowers in the ways that are required given their rights under the law. I think that the fact of COVID really threw a lot of those failures into really stark relief. While this is all nonpartisan, I think having the right folks in the building, and specifically real champions for student loan borrowers in the Biden administration, has made a huge difference. And I think the kind of action that they have taken first to restore the promises of specifically broken protections like the public service loan forgiveness program and like income-driven repayment, all the way down to nuts and bolts of fixing issues with disability discharge, and then also now working to promote accountability in the long term, evidences that the people at work in the Biden administration really are committed to protecting student loan borrowers and kind of fearlessly approaching the areas that have proven to be so broken. And then to the other kind of half of your question, which how do we ensure that these protections both, are themselves protected and they also are able to filter through to the borrowers who need them most? It's really going to be an all hands effort. We see the Biden administration continuing to work to strengthen protections. For example, there were announcements today about income-driven repayment and the ability borrowers will have to secure payments that they might have otherwise lost due to forbearance steering by student loan servicers. We're going to need every single person in the advocacy community and on the Hill and in the administration, and even just folks watching at home, to be holding policymakers accountable, to be speaking up loudly in instances where they themselves are harmed or are denied their rights, and for everyone to have to really keep up these kind of hard won victories that we already have.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I think building on this question of how do we offer supports, I want to turn to Carolina, who oversees the Education Debt Consumer Assistance Program at CSSNY, which was created to help New Yorkers navigate the student loan repayment system. So Carolina, what are the most common questions you're receiving from borrowers right now? And these are borrowers who I'm sure are very excited about the recent announcements, but also maybe fearful or concerned with questions around who qualifies, when they'll know if they qualify, when they know when the debt relief has come, and how do they know who they can trust? Obviously, CSSNY is fulfilling this role in New York, but as people across the country think about, should I answer this call from my loan servicer? Should I respond to this email? How do we ensure that there are protections in place and that people can, again, get the information they so desperately need?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there's like three categories of questions that we get is obviously from borrowers that are just confirming, I already signed up for cancellation. Did I do the right thing? Anything else I should know? It was too simple, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, and they can't believe it's real. So that's the good news, good group. Then you have the second group of people who may also be pursuing, for example, public service loan forgiveness and the temporary waiver, and they're completely lost, confused. They don't know, for example, some of them, are they clicking on the right application? Is it the same thing? Can they apply for both? And the answer is yes. You can apply for both cancellation and continue to pursue public service loan forgiveness or any other federal relief program available out there. We always want to be mindful to caution people about scams. We do get those callers from time to time who say, hey, I got a call and they need my student ID information in order to help me out. And that is obviously inaccurate. Those are scams and we want to be aware of those. And then we have the third group of people that really breaks my heart. And those are people who have commercially felt loans. And the announcement last month of people who didn't consolidate prior to the 28th of September are literally being left out. And my heart goes out to them because they're the ones that have been in repayment for 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. And their loan balances can actually be relatively small, and they would have been debt-free had they been able to take advantage of cancellation. And so that is really hard to swallow when you cannot deliver good news. So that's kind of like the gamut of where we're at. I think moving forward, as Ben mentioned, there has to be all hands on deck, accountability and transparency. And also, I will say, as I do this for a daily living where I provide consumer assistance and my team guides people through the complex system, people really, really need unbiased one-on-one consumer assistance. We cannot rely on student loan servicers to do their job, and we know that. And so we really need to be providing people across the US, not just in New York, with the help and tools they need to, one, understand the different options that they have and really take advantage of those options to manage and whenever possible, eliminate their student loan debt.
Thank you, Caroline. And I do have a quick follow-up question. I want to remind our viewers that the Q&A feature is still open in Zoom, but one of the questions that we got a lot during the sort of pre-submission period was around PSLF. So we know just last month, New York Governor Kathy Hochul signed legislation that expanded and simplified access to PSLF statewide. This is going to eliminate barriers, make it easier for working New Yorkers who are in qualifying employment to receive a tax-free debt cancellation or the remainder of their balance being forgiven. I wonder if you can talk about how progressive legislation and the work of direct service organizations like EdCap to mitigate some of that burden on student loan borrowers happens.
So one of the big changes that we have seen across the US is states taking a more proactive role, not only legislatively, but also by creating ombudsmen, student loan ombudsman offices. And that couldn't be more appropriate. States have a direct responsibility to protect their own constituents, right? Their own residents. And in New York, for example, as you just mentioned, we just created a legislation and passed and it was signed to make it easier for borrowers to benefit from the public service loan forgiveness program. And that basically just got ahead of the game. The federal government is looking to reform the public service loan forgiveness program, for example, to deem 30 hours full-time to meet that program requirement. And so that means that at least in New York, we're going to get a lot more borrowers benefiting from the public service loan forgiveness program. And again, the takeaway there is that states must take a more proactive role in providing the support borrowers need, the consumer protections they need at every opportunity. We can no longer just rely on the federal government to do it. We are very fortunate that we have the right leadership right now that hands down to them. They've been working really hard to implement all these changes, but things change. And so we must make sure that states take a proactive role whenever possible, again, to provide additional relief measures and protect consumers.
Amazing. And I know with some of our subsequent questions, we're going to get into sort of state-federal partnerships a little bit more, but I do want to continue to focus on the federal government. So I have a question for Jared. How can the federal government slow the rising student loan debt? I know obviously a lot of our time has been spent talking about the announced cancellation plans. And while this obviously is a victory and one that we want to signal, it isn't really the solution to our growing debt crisis. How do we prevent future debt crises while also addressing the one that we're currently in? And what are the factors that go into that? Is it just college costs? Is it college quality? And at what point does the federal government step in to intervene? In this iteration, we've seen obviously very bold legislative and in other forms of championing reforms. But what more can be done to address our growing debt crisis?
Thanks, Yara. So there's a lot that we can do to actually prevent, another student debt crisis from emerging and actually addressing the root causes of the student debt crisis. I think, debt cancellation is certainly the first step, and some of what my colleagues have talked about improving the student loan system, fixing loan forgiveness programs such as PSLF and other programs will be helpful. Also IDR, income-driven repayment. But beyond that, I think just acknowledging that we have a debt finance system, like our system is, created for students when they are deciding to go to college to take on debt to finance their higher education. And so fixing that model at the outset will actually help to prevent further student debt crises from emerging in the future. Just to put a finer, point on this, so the federal government, makes new loans available every year to the tune of about $85 billion expected for, I think, fiscal year 2022, 2023. The number doesn't really change that much. But that dwarfs, Pell Grants, as you say, dwarf in comparison to the, loan volume. And also federal work study, FSEOG, so that actually the federal government makes more available in terms of aid through loans than we do through Pell Grants, federal work study, the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, FSEOG. And so that's something that we may want to take a look at if we don't want people to take out loans, rack up debt. That's a concern. You asked the question, is it accountability, is it affordability? I think it's both. I think that they're, two sides of the same coin. No student, including myself when I went to college, expects to go to school, take out debt, and then go to an institution that is funded by taxpayers. It's funded, that the federal government approved. They don't expect to go to a low quality institution that's not going to prepare them for economic mobility and for success. That's a system that we have right now. We have a lot of bad actors who offer poor education and poor outcomes to their students, but they're still within the federal system. They're still approved and operational. They're approved to operate. They're operational, and they are not providing the return on investment that we would expect from, the investment the federal government makes. So that's another thing we can do, is just to hold institutions accountable, making sure that they provide a quality education so that when students do choose to walk through the doors of a college institution or, even online, that they are receiving a quality education that's going to leave them better off than when they arrived. Too often right now, we have a system that does not leave some students better off than when they arrived, and that's a problem. So we need to do more to crack down on that.
And when you talk about quality, who's responsible for ensuring quality at the institutional level? There are obviously a number of people who are part of the broader higher education system, but where should those accountability measures and efforts be targeted, both on the part of consumers and on the part of advocates?
So there's really a tripartite system for accountability or for quality called the Program Integrity Triad. In its purest form, what's supposed to happen is that the federal government, states, and accreditors all work together to ensure that the university is performing well, offering a quality education, and also offering degrees that are of value. And for several reasons, I think we've had I always refer to this as a three-legged stool. So when that stool is even, and basically all the Title IV dollars, all the tax payer dollars sit on top. When that stool is level, when it's even, when everyone's doing their part in unison, the stool works and it holds up the investment. But when any one leg is missing or is not living up to its part, the stool starts to slant, and all that investment, all those dollars begin to be wasted. So when we don't have accreditors actually doing their job to assess quality and reviewing institutions or being the watchdogs that they are supposed to be, when we don't have states engaged as they used to be as far as what degrees are conferred, how their institutions are operating, and then we also don't have the federal government doing its part to actually enforce federal regulations and the laws, and also providing opportunities for relief for borrowers, that does create some concerns. So really all three actors are supposed to be involved in this system. Traditionally we do look to accreditors to assess quality, but I would really say it's all three, performing that tripartite function of quality and accountability.
Thank you, Jared. And I want to turn to Peter. Obviously, again, accountability is one side of the coin, but affordability plays a really important role in determining not only where students can attend, but determining how they're going to be able to afford to repay any loans that they have to use in order to participate in our sort of debt finance system. We've seen rising tuition prices and fees for students into considerable debt, and policymakers have attempted to address decreasing fiscal support in the public sector through proposals like federal-state partnerships that would eliminate tuition and fees at community colleges, but we've seen some of these efforts fall by the wayside and become deprioritized. And while, again, we're very excited about the cancellation announcement, we do want to point out that this is a moment when we can build on what's already a burgeoning commitment to addressing higher ed affordability and accountability. What can Congress do to address equity concerns about college affordability, and how can those measures ensure that people who pursue college degrees are able to graduate without a lifetime of debt repayments?
Thanks, Tiara. My name is Peter, and I study policy efforts to improve college affordability at TCF. Congress can do a lot. You mentioned a federal-state partnership, which is a program passed by Congress in which states and the federal government share the costs of a new initiative. States accept the federal money on certain conditions. States have a lot of power over the cost of public education, and public colleges enroll 3/4 of college students. One reason why families pay so much for college today is because the investment by states into public higher education hasn't kept up with the costs of that education. In other words, American families foot an increasingly large bill. So one goal of a federal-state partnership for college affordability is to incentivize state investment in public higher education. It does that by incentivizing states with that new federal funding, and then families won't have to pay as much and won't have to take on as much student loan debt. The Biden administration has proposed a federal-state partnership called America's College Promise, or ACP. ACP would establish a partnership to set community college tuition at zero. You may hear me say this and think, all that is nice, but community college tuition is not the reason why we have $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. But let me make a few points about how the bill would help. Remember, states would receive that new funding on certain conditions. One of the conditions is that states maintain their funding for public higher education, not just for community colleges, but for public four-year colleges too. If ACP is passed, states that join can't let their funding for higher ed backslide. That has real implications for the cost burden on students at public colleges. Second, let's imagine a world where community college nationwide tuition is pegged at $0. Higher education is a competition for students, and other sectors will face a lot more pressure to keep their costs low. Finally, states would actually have about $5 billion per year in leftover funding after they've eliminated tuition at community colleges. States can then spend that on grant aid for four-year students, which reduces the net cost of college at public universities. Those are a few ways that even a smaller federal-state partnership like ACP can reduce student debt. That's not the only proposal. Others include the Debt-Free College Act, which aims for students to attend public college without taking on debt, and the College for All Act, which would eliminate tuition at community colleges and, for many families, at public 4 years too. So that's the federal-state partnership side. I think it's important to start there in these conversations. Congress can also double the Pell Grant. This helps low-income students not only pay for tuition, but also their housing, food, books, and more. Congress can invest more in HBCUs and other MSIs. As a consequence of the racial wealth gap, HBCUs have very high rates of student borrowing among their students and very high rates of Parent Plus borrowing. My colleague Denise Smith has written about how Congress should bolster the finances of those institutions so that families can attend one of those schools without having to borrow. Congress can also make DACA recipients eligible for federal financial aid. I'll stop there, but thinking back to 1 year ago, we were debating a Build Back Better agenda that would have transformed higher education opportunity in the US. I don't see the fact that it wasn't passed as a no, never, but rather a not yet. Student debt cancellation is a perfect opportunity to remind members of Congress how important it is that they pass that agenda.
Thank you, Peter. I want to turn back to Ben for a second. We are now getting a ton of questions in the Q&A feature, which I'm very thankful for, and encourage people to continue submitting questions. A lot of our focus has been, again, on this wider debt relief program. But for borrowers who have other questions and other concerns, whether it's about how their student loan debt affects their credit score, if it's about whether or not they're eligible for relief through other means, what are the places that they can go? Where do they start? If a borrower is worried about whether it's a bankruptcy, whether a loan is eligible for forgiveness, whether it's, again, what that impact is going to be on their credit score. So we've talked about the myriad of ways that debt can affect our ability to do things like get an apartment, get a car, get a cosigner, be a cosigner. What are the options for borrowers? Where do they go?
Well, so the best place to go, especially as it pertains to just cancellation, and also to the new announcements around public service loan forgiveness, is I'm sure we all have our different resources, not to say that SPPCs are the best, but we have this great website called forgivemystudentdebt.org. I can drop that in some variety of chat if that'll actually reach people. Maybe not. It is forgivemystudentdebt.org. We keep that updated with the latest and greatest on cancellation. I think I haven't really been looking at the Q&A, but to the points you raised, Tiara, on credit scores, we don't actually know yet how the department is going to be furnishing people's loans post-cancellation. So I think there was a question about bankruptcy. Our understanding is that, oh, thank you. Our understanding is that even with the changes that were announced today regarding the IDR adjustment, the income-driven repayment adjustment, payments that were made for people who are in payment plans in bankruptcy will not, unfortunately, be counted toward credit for cancellation under income-driven repayment, or by extension to public service loan forgiveness. There are a couple other shortcomings of the IDR adjustment that was announced today. For example, our understanding is that Parent Plus borrowers will get credit toward income-driven cancellation under income-driven repayment, but not have that flow through to credit toward public service loan forgiveness. There also remain huge problems where borrowers who owe on spousal consolidation loans and who just won that really hard-fought victory of trying to get a bill passed in Congress to allow those borrowers to separate their loans still don't have a clear pathway forward for how they can access public service loan forgiveness or cancellation. So with all that said, though, we'll keep our website updated.
Well, and sticking with this theme, especially around things like IDR, which is going to be so crucial for borrowers moving forward, is there a current plan for how these loan companies might restructure things like compound interest? We've talked a lot about interest capitalization and how people are continuing to make payments without seeing their balance go down. And while they may be financially healthy in the sense that they are making payments, they're not in default, just sort of mentally the anguish that people experience in making considerable payments and never seeing that balance decrease is a big issue. Is the department doing anything to address these concerns around capitalization and how interest is compounded for borrowers?
Yeah, no, it's really such an unbelievable problem where you see borrowers who are paying every month the amount that they're billed and they still see their balance grow. And over time, you see borrowers who pay multiples of what they've borrowed and who still owe either more than they initially borrowed or still some massive amount of outstanding debt. Now, part of that problem will hopefully be addressed by the new income-driven repayment plan that the department announced on August 24th, alongside the cancellation action. It'll be called expanded income contingent repayment, or extended, sorry. And it is much more generous in certain ways than any other income-based repayment plan that we've ever seen before. So it does a few things. First of all, it cuts in half the percent of discretionary income that borrowers will have to pay each month on their loan. And then it also increases the amount of overall income that is shielded from being counted as discretionary. And in fact, it raises that floor up to 225% of poverty guidance, which is roughly the equivalent of what you would earn over a year if you were working for $15 an hour for 40 hours a week. That new plan also includes certain features like allowing people to get cancellation after only 10 years if they borrowed, I think it's $12,500 or less. And also, to your point, Tiara, it will borrowers who are in that payment plan will have any residual amounts that they owe each month after they make their payment be subsidized so that their balance won't continue growing if they're making the payments that they owe. And that is a huge effect for so many people. You know, when income-driven repayment was introduced, the reasoning that borrowers faced was that they didn't have to worry about their balances because after all, they would be canceled. And that's kind of false in the first place because a growing balance can affect your credit score and affect your ability to take on something like a mortgage, and also has a huge psychological effect. But even further, we've seen over history that mismanagement by student loan servicing companies has belied the promise of eventual cancellation that so much of our reasoning around income-driven repayment was based on. Now, I should say, though, that there are still shortcomings of the plan that the administration announced, and specifically, it's that a lot of PLUS borrowers, including Grad PLUS and Parent PLUS borrowers, are going to be excluded from this really generous plan. And as I think Peter was talking about, when you really dig under the hood of what goes on in reality with PLUS loans, very often those loans are taken on by parents of color whose children have already exhausted federal student loan eligibility and Pell Grant eligibility, and who are then leveraging the entire household just to pursue economic opportunity for their own kids, right? And so when we exclude Parent PLUS borrowers, you know, I think a lot of folks on the Hill and a lot of folks inside the administration imagining that we are trying to kind of be responsible around the ability of parents to take on loans that they will probably be able to repay, when in fact, all that we are doing is excluding people who are already the most financially pressed and who have already been systematically denied the opportunities of higher education. So to land on the point that I kind of started with, we need everybody to keep pushing. I mean, these are huge steps forward policy-wise, but there's so much more work to do, and it's going to really take a village.
Thank you, Ben. Peter, I want to turn to you because we have so many questions in the chat, and Ben has already been great about lifting up Parent PLUS borrowers in particular. So earlier when I talked about the people who may have student loan debt despite not attending college themselves, many of those people are Parent PLUS borrowers, people who are making an investment in their children who have a considerable burden even after they've exhausted their financial aid and have taken on student loans of their own. What do Parent PLUS borrowers need to know about the cancellation that's available to them?
Yes, well, the good news, Parent PLUS loans under the direct loan program are eligible for cancellation. If you are a parent who has Parent PLUS loans, and if you meet the income eligibility requirements, you should apply. Now, that means you should know that loans are canceled on a per borrower basis, not a per loan basis. So if you have Parent PLUS loans and loans for your own education, the sum total of those balances is reduced by $10,000 or $20,000, depending on whether or not you received Pell. Now, something to know for Parent PLUS borrowers who sent a child to school on a Pell Grant is that you do need to find out if you yourself got a Pell Grant if/when you went to college yourself. That is what determines your eligibility for $20,000. So that's kind of an important thing to be aware of. Parent PLUS loans are also technically eligible for PSLF. They have to be consolidated first, and unfortunately, they were not part of the PSLF temporary waiver and would not get retroactive repayment credit. So the good news is they are included. However, make sure that you understand the full details.
And turning back to our Q&A feature, which again, thank you for continuing to submit questions. Carolina, there are a lot of questions from people who may have private loans as well. We've talked a lot about the benefits that are offered to people who have direct loans. So those people who have access to things like the current debt forgiveness plan announced by the Biden-Harris administration and public service loan forgiveness, as well as access to very generous income-driven repayment programs. Have private student loan borrowers been left out? What are the recourses that those borrowers have if they're struggling with payments? Obviously, during the more active part of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were some protections that were put in place, but those were very much left up to the servicer. Are there more things that are available, and what advice can we give to people who have private loans and are worried about what happens?
Yeah, so I mean, the problem with private loans is that if you have a private loan, chances are you also have federal debt. And so now we see clients trying to manage their federal student loans, their private loans. We see parents trying to manage their own debt, the Parent Plus, and their own kids' debt. So it's a nightmare. I am actually genuinely concerned that when the payment pause resumes, we're going to see a higher level of delinquency and default, in part because parents have been able, or borrowers, I should say, have been able to keep their private loans in good standing because they haven't had to pay their federal loans. And when it comes to private loans, a big takeaway, a lot of people get confused. If you co-sign a student loan, chances are that's a private loan and that is not a federal Parent Plus loan. So there's still basics of confusion. Like we get clients 10 years later and they thought it was a federal loan. And we have to break down the bad news. This was actually a private loan and your options are less limited. They could sue you, they will go after you, and so forth. So treat it like credit card debt or any other type of loan. They want their money. They're gonna ask you to pay. You could be delinquent within the first payment missed. Reach out. There's resources, legal aid societies, and other organizations that focus on consumer debt credit. Reach out to have a strategy, especially if you're one of those parents that is going to struggle when payments resume. You want to have a game plan. I also want to put a quick note about the Parent Plus discussion. Parent Plus loans are the crisis within our student loan crisis. And I say that because we've been getting a lot of Parent Plus loans borrowers coming to us thinking that they qualify for PSLF or trying to learn about their options when it comes to PSLF. And I can tell you that a good percentage, maybe 30–40%, are not going to be able to afford any repayment plan. Let me repeat that. They're not going to be able to afford any repayment plan come January. And that's because their average Parent Plus debt is $150,000. Think about that. So it's going to be a matter of time before they fall behind. They are literally asking us, how long can I go with forbearances? That's never the plan. That's never the strategy. We have parents, the issue of like accountability, personal responsibility when it comes to student debt. I have parents who have drained their 401ks to pay for their kids' education, only to see their income increase for that year. And then their kids are not eligible for any of the grant aid that they were getting because on paper, their parents made too much money. So now we have multiple generations with student loan balances that they cannot afford, they cannot manage. And when it comes to federal student loan debt, it's going to follow them to their grave. So I just wanted to say that and get it out there. If you're a Parent Plus loan borrower, make some noise. You're going to need to make some noise for people to really listen to you and know that this was never right to begin with. They should have never put this burden on you and given you the highest interest rate out there when it comes to federal loans.
Carolina, so true. And thank you so much. There are so many comments and questions that we're getting specifically from Parent Plus borrowers who are concerned about how they're going to be able to make these payments. And it's something that's so important. And speaking of things that we should be making noise about, I want to turn back to Jared. One of the questions that we're getting is who's doing work to reduce the cost of higher education? And when we think about that, I'd say a lot of different things go into that, not only the cost of tuition, but also who's being responsible for monitoring or trying to reduce or rein in the costs and fees that are associated with pursuing higher education. Additionally, what are we doing to actually support institutions? So, there's obviously an institutional decision that is made about how increases in tuition happen. Sometimes states are involved, sometimes board of trustees are involved, but how do we make noise about this issue and ensure that we are bringing more attention to the fact that student loan debt and the sort of rampant increase that we've seen in borrowing is really due to our inability to rein in costs?
Yeah, so I would say that Center for American Progress is doing work on controlling the cost of higher education. I would also say that groups that are engaged in this kind of free college conversation are also engaged in the reduction of college costs. When you have the tuition brought down to zero for eligible families, that's a cost control. You can't go really lower than zero. You can in some cases, but not here. So I would say that anyone who's looking at providing the lowest tuition and providing those benefits is looking at controlling the cost of college and doing so through a federal-state partnership. And also looking at cost control models or cost sharing models where we have either states pay a share of the investment, or having institutions pay a share of the direct investment as well, which is something that we're looking at. And so I think that those can help deal with college costs, but also just thinking about the types of institutions that we have participating in the system. Either those who are there to help benefit the students, or those who are there to benefit themselves. To be frank. So I think if we look at the for-profit sector and controlling some of those issues, maybe we wouldn't see kind of the abuses that we've seen historically, are also the need to have debt discharges, which are beneficial for borrowers. But if we had controlled institutions like Corinthian colleges, or ITT, we wouldn't have had to put borrowers through that in the first place. So that can also, I think, bring down costs, and for borrowers in particular, if we just make sure that people are going to a quality institution. So I think cost is part of it, and quality are the same conversation. I think we don't want to have people in a situation where they are taking out massive amounts of loans, for an education that's actually not going to serve them well when they go into the marketplace. And I think, as part of this conversation, thinking about, is education a private good, where we're just concerned about borrowers who, have taken on these loans, like they decide to do it, but also viewing education or higher education as a public good, and thinking about, the benefits that it brings to families, to communities through, investments in various areas, and just the public welfare. So I think that there is work being done, certainly, to control college costs and looking at, kind of the sources of it. One of the interesting things about higher education is that it really was about controlling college costs, and it really was about providing access. So prior to the federal investment in higher education, college education, college degree was really reserved for the elite in our society. But then there was this massive shift through the federal investment to make that opportunity available for various families who are middle income or low income. And so I think we want to preserve that for sure, but also balancing that with an understanding that college costs have outpaced inflation for decades. So that's work that we're carrying out, this work that we're doing, various ways to do it, but we're looking at different models, certainly do it. And free college and free community college is certainly one way.
Thanks, Jared. I want to turn and sort of open it up, because I really think this question could be answered by either or both Ben and Carolina. We are getting a lot of questions from people that are just very practical. What are the steps that I need to do to get relief? But also, which should come first? If I think I'm eligible for public service loan forgiveness and I want to apply for cancellation, does that have to come in a certain order? Will the debt be forgiven in a certain order? Can I apply for both? I encourage either or both of you to address that.
Yeah, so I can start. You can apply for both. The big deadline that you want to focus on is for PSLF, the temporary waiver. The deadline is the 31st. And for that, you want to make sure, this is for public service loan forgiveness, you want to make sure that you have direct loans. And if you don't, you would need to consolidate them. There's a caveat now. If you have a mix of FFEL, Perkins, and direct loans, you might want to just leave your direct loans alone and only consolidate the FFEL and Perkins, because if you consolidate both the direct with FFEL and Perkins, you might void cancellation, meaning you won't get cancellation. So again, takeaway, just make sure you have direct loans. If you do, you don't need to consolidate. If you have FFEL and Perkins, just consolidate those. A lot of people get confused that they have a FFELP consolidated loan and they think they no longer can consolidate. You can. If it's a FFELP, whether consolidated or not, you can consolidate it for the purposes of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And then you want to make sure that using the PSLF help tool, you generate the employment certification forms. As long as you generate them by Monday, the 31st, it will be day stamped and you should be okay. The Department of Education will take those forms afterwards. If you're using the PDF paper form, you want to make sure that your employer is dating it by the 31st in order for the government to take them. So PSLF is definitely the one for you to look into this remaining PSLF waiver week. And then cancellation at this point, technically you have time, but we do recommend that you also apply for cancellation. You could do both at the same time. Because, you know, we want you to get in the queue, and as soon as we get the green light or the government gets the green light, hopefully they'll start processing them and you'll have an outcome in a matter of weeks. So yeah, you can pursue both, not a problem on those. Just be aware of the October 31st deadline with PSLF.
Then I also want to give you some space if there's anything that you want to address just in terms of a lot of these questions that are very practical. How do I do it? What do I do? I've now dropped the link for you to access the PSLF help tool in the chat, but for people who are seeking access to other forms of cancellation, where should they go? Who do they turn to?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, echo everything Carolina said. Don't hesitate. Don't wait to apply for cancellation if you think you qualify under the broad-based cancellation. If you make under $125,000 or $250,000 for a household, it takes truly like 30 seconds to put your name, last name, social security number, some other stuff. Like really, people report that it takes less than a minute. And there is no penalty for applying if you aren't eligible. So truly, don't wait. Even though, again, like there's an injunction surrounding cancellation right now, but there's not an injunction against the department collecting people's applications, so you should do that. And then with PSLF, as folks have mentioned, the help tool is really great. If you have problems with the help tool, you can reach out to Ed, you can reach out to your servicer, or you can reach out to us. And yeah, I just want to get your forms in as soon as possible. I know like we are really counting down the days on the PSLF waiver, which expires on the 31st. There are certain aspects of it are going to still be available, which was announced today. But more generally, folks should really be trying to get their forms in as soon as possible.
I'm going to turn back to Carolina for a specific question from the chat. So as we've talked about consolidation and sort of trying to make clear what it means to consolidate a loan, for people who will now be locked out of access because they consolidated before the announcement about which loans would still be eligible for cancellation, do they have any recourse? And also, I guess, taking a step back, how do people even know what kind of loans they have? How do people know how to make an informed decision about consolidation?
Yeah, so I've learned that there's no easy case or answer when it comes to providing guidance. But here's a tip. If you have federal student loans, you're going to have a studentaid.gov account. If you haven't accessed that account, you can go and access it. If you've never created a profile, you can create one. If you forgot your username or password, you can reset it on the spot. You will be okay. You'll eventually have access to that. That is the database for all federal student loans. So if you have a federal student loan, including a commercially held FFELP loan, which I'm not going to get too much into because that's an entire workshop, you can actually go there and get to your aid. It says My Aid. Scroll down to loan types, and there's going to be like different buckets of loans, and you just want to click on every arrow. And as long as it has the word direct, you're going to be okay. Now, I want to send you over to Forgive My Student Debt website because there's tons of videos and instructional materials on how to do all of this. This is like a separate workshop conversation. Now, if you're joining this webinar, I will commit that even if you're not from New York, I will help you out. I will put my email in the chat. And you can reach out if you really have like a burning question that you must meet the deadline by the 31st. If you don't have to meet the deadline by the 31st, just let me know and I will meet with you afterwards. And was there another question, Tara, that I?
Just about recourse. So because the announcement about consolidated loans and which loans would actually be eligible for cancellation didn't occur until after some people may have consolidated, or people who were thinking about it got different advice, whether it's from their servicers or the education department. Do they have a recourse at this point?
So not that I know of any. I do know that the current administration obviously did not intend to leave people out because they've been working so hard on this. All I can say is chances are there's going to be lawsuits out there about this. And sometimes not from the right people. They're going to be suing, saying like you left people out. But as of right now, unless Ben or others know otherwise, there is unfortunately no recourse. I can tell you from an advocate perspective, I literally consolidated loans that morning and later on found out that the clients that I served that morning were going to be left out. So I think everyone was on the same boat, caught a little bit off guard, but then.
Yeah, I've got nothing, unfortunately. Our understanding is that these borrowers basically have no recourse and at no fault of their own, and it's dumb.
Can I also add really quickly? I think there was a question in the chat, and I know other people have asked, like, what do we do if it's being challenged? What's the status on that? I literally went online to see if there was a breaking news because I've missed breaking news, and my clients might sometimes find out because I'm working, and then we find out that something happened. So it was a temporary halt. We're hoping that in a matter of days we'll know, and hopefully the Department of Education will continue to move forward. Now, the general advice is apply. You don't lose anything by applying. And if they get the green light and start canceling that, it would be very difficult, I want to say, for them to then go back and force the servicers to recoup that money that has been canceled. But if at any point the court says, yeah, you couldn't do that, we need you to stop and don't approve more applications, then you want to make sure you're first in line, you're in the queue, and if you get it, great. Again, I'm just like pretending like best case scenario, worst case scenario, just apply. If you qualify, apply. You don't lose anything. Go ahead and do it. It sends a big message when 22 million borrowers have applied already, right? Like I thought I was number 3. I was probably the 7th million because this is how popular this is, right? So there's really no harm. Just apply. It doesn't hurt for you to just get in the queue at this point.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great note, but I do want to give everyone a chance. I'd like to do one more pass for everyone to leave a sort of one thing you'd like for people to take away from this event, one piece of information, whether it's a website to visit, whether it's a resource, whether it's a message and a call to action, one thing you'd like for people to leave this webinar with. And let's start with Peter.
Yes, excuse me. Well, cancellations good, but there's still so much to be done. The administration deserves a lot of credit for doing what they can do to make life easier for student loan borrowers with the power that they have. The ball is now in Congress's court. What we can do is keep the pressure on our elected officials to do their part to create affordable pathways to and through college.
Jared.
Sure. So I would just say debt cancellation is the first step, and the conversation exposed so much about what's not working with the student loan system. But as Peter said, more work we need to do to actually address the root causes of the student debt crisis and of a lack of affordability within our system. And we can do that, through the appropriations process, through the legislative vehicles, and actually engaging with the system, and calling for more of these efforts for accountability of institutions, for investments in Pell, and other federal financial aid programs. So I just want to leave everyone with just to say that just because we may see debt cancellation, like let's keep the energy up and let's keep moving forward to create a system that actually works for borrowers now, but also future generations of borrowers as well.
Thanks so much, Jared. Ben, one parting word.
There's an election in 14 days and you need to vote.
Been with perhaps one of the most important party messages. And Carolina, in addition to the number of people who are asking for your contact information and how they can get involved with EdCap, what is another message you would like viewers to have?
One thing that you guys as borrowers have done really well is to raise your voices. You're no longer in the shadows. You're no longer holding this debt. You're no longer hopefully blaming yourself that you made a mistake, that you didn't pay attention, that you should have known better. The system was designed to make us all fail. So keep raising your voices. And I know people were asking like, how? Go vote. Go vote, make some noise, go to your representatives. They work for you. You are a taxpayer. Demand more, you deserve more. And higher ed should be the key to upward mobility, not something that brings you down for an entire lifetime. Keep making some noise.
Carolina, thank you so much. We have spent much of this discussion pointing out not only all of the good that's being done now, but really opening up space for us to think about what the future of higher education can look like. We know that the burden of student loans disproportionately impact borrowers of color, women, and those who attend for-profit institutions. But how do we turn that data into action? Experts and advocates really have to band together and demand action from elected officials to control costs and enforce accountability measures. While the Biden-Harris administration's debt relief announcement is a victory, there's still so much more that needs to be done to ensure higher education isn't out of reach for so many people. We encourage you to stay tuned for more from TCF and all of the agencies, as well as all of the individuals you've seen on this call. We are all doing work not only on higher education, but a variety of other issues. If eligible, please be sure to submit your debt relief and PSLF waiver applications before their respective deadlines. As Carolina has driven home, the PSLF waiver expires in just 6 days. If you're eligible for student loan cancellation, the department recommends you submit your application by November 15th to ensure that any January student loan bills you owe or may owe reflect that adjusted balance. Thank you all so much for attending this event. A special thank you again to our speakers, Jared Bass, Peter Granville, Ben Kaufman, and Carolina Rodriguez, as well as a thank you to our home organization, the Century Foundation. This recording will be made available online at tcf.org, and we're so thankful. I see all of the questions that are coming in. Please be mindful. You will receive a follow-up email that will have links to resources. We are here to support and help you, and we want to ensure that everyone has the information that's so crucial to make informed decisions. Thank you again for joining us.